Derbyshire is a lovely child's alphabet, an alluring first lesson in all that's admirable. Well, those were the words of John Ruskin, and he could easily have been describing Monsall Dale, where the River Wye meanders its way through one of the most picturesque views in the Derbyshire Dales. And it's no mere chance that the river flows through this beautiful valley, for it actually created it over thousands of years of persistent erosion into the limestone beneath. Here at Monsall Head, we get a marvellous view of the Dale and all the surrounding countryside. And in fact, here, we're right in the middle of the Peak District National Park. And yet, Sheffield is only 15 miles to the north, and we're 25 miles from Derby and Nottingham. Between the years 1861 and 1968, the Dale echoed to the sound of steam trains on the main line from London to Manchester. Sadly, though, the old railway line is now gone. But this famous five-arched viaduct still stands to remind us of those early railway engineers. During the summer months, the area bustles with life, because wherever you go in the Dales, you'll find hikers and cyclists. And as we're going to spend our day out 4 miles down the valley from here, in the town of Bakewell, what better way to get there than by bike? Just behind the Monsall Head is a cycle hire centre. For a couple of £1 you can hire a bike, whether it be a racing one or something a little more sedate, from a few hours to a few days.
That's 6B, some 42B, Nick.
Leave your car in the car park, complete the minimum of formalities, and then pedal away. Cycle clips and pump included, just in case.
There's a lock and a toolkit in the back.
Yep.
In the bag. And we'll just check the seat height for adjustment when you're on.
All right. How's that? Well, it feels about right.
That feels okay for you?
Yep. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay. Have a good trip.
Okay, thanks. Well, there you are, you see. Once you've hired your bike, the freedom of Derbyshire is yours. I'm glad to say that from here, Bakewell is more or less all downhill. We're going to go through Little Longston, that road, and then through part of the Peak Park called White Peak, which is very beautiful countryside indeed. Actually, I did think about having dropped handlebars, but I think I can see over the stone walls better this way, so let's go. The Peak District was Britain's first national park, created in 1951 to preserve this unique landscape. It's been a struggle, though, to keep the park a beautiful expanse of countryside, because it's not just a holiday area, but home for thousands of people, a living and working place. The stone-built houses in small, sleepy villages still serve to shelter the inhabitants from the variable weather. These villages of grey stone are always noted for their warm hospitality, and to this day, the Peak Planning Board still insists that new dwellings are constructed from local stone. Thankfully, with just a mile or so to go, we catch our first glimpse of Bakewell, nestling quietly in its valley. Phew. Well, it may be all downhill. There's more to these Derbyshire Dales than meets the eye, I can tell you. We've approached Bakewell from the north, around Castle Hill, which was reputed to be a stronghold of Edward the Elder about 1,000 years ago, but recent excavations seem to say that it might have been a Norman Motte and Bailey castle. I'm talking about digging things up. They're digging up what I've come to see first. in my journey to Bakewell. And that's Bakewell Bridge, which is just one of the reasons why Bakewell grew up on this site anyway. It was a useful crossing point, and Bakewell Bridge, a lovely bridge which spans the river, is certainly one of the oldest in England. It was built in 1539 to replace a former bridge standing on the same site. There are 5 Gothic arches. The triangular recesses on top were used by pedestrians to avoid being run down by jostling pack horses. Today, the bridge serves as an interesting vantage point to meet some of Bakewell's youngest inhabitants. Well, it took me long enough to get here, and now I think certain parts of me could do with a rest from this saddle. And so I'm going to lock the bike up in the car park over here and get a taste of Bakewell on foot for a change. Maybe I should explain a little bit more about why Bakewell grew up in this location. The influence of the river helped, and with the town lying in a sheltered valley, it's also protected from the cold north and east winds. But the discovery of at least 5 warm water wells, which used to supply the town with a constant flow of fresh water at a steady temperature of 59 degrees Fahrenheit, certainly would have attracted early settlers. And it's from those once vital water supplies that Bakewell gets its name, Bar being short for bad, meaning bath in Anglo-Saxon, and Quell meaning a well or a spring. And it's more than probable that the Romans occupied this area, attracted maybe by those warm springs, because, as we all know, they never could resist a warm bath. Looking around, you notice there's a world of difference between, say, the black and white half-timbered cottages in Worcestershire and the grey stone towns of northern Derbyshire. It takes a bit of getting used to, but Bakewell soon grows on you. And high up on the hill overlooking the rooftops, the parish church of Bakewell dominates the surroundings. It's unusually large for the size of town. In fact, the building has been persistently added to and altered over the past 1,000 years. Edmund Urquhart, you're the vicar of a very high and windy church, I think, aren't you, up here?
Yes, we're not quite at the top of the hill, and I think there are some churches in the country even higher, but not many that stand on such a steep slope.
Taking a second look at the church, though, why are there 2 different ages of stonework in the building?
150 years ago, the tower was in a state of collapse. The feeling was that the whole church would have to be rebuilt. But the young architect from Sheffield, William Flockton, staked his reputation, in fact, on something quite different. He thought that the patient could be cured by surgery. And he chopped the building open from north to south and rebuilt the tower and the spire on top of it, although 15 feet shorter. He rebuilt the north transept and the south transept and then joined these, and you can still see the medieval stonework of the nave and chancel as they were then and still are.
While they were undertaking these drastic excavations, they made some astonishing discoveries, didn't they?
They found what is now, I believe, the best collection in the country of ancient gravestones, which are now mostly collected in the porch of the church. I think the tendency was for the more influential people to be buried inside the church, and so you've got here a pair of sheep shears, which might in fact not represent a shepherd, but possibly a wool merchant. Somebody relatively powerful and influential. This key might represent not a locksmith, although there were smiths, but perhaps a landowner. We have a chalice. I think that's quite clear that it must have been a priest who was buried there. And moving across to these wonderful stones with their most intricate and beautiful carving, exciting carving, coming down here to the symbol of St. Mark the gospel writer, whose symbol was a lion, and there's his name just beneath the carving, Marcus. All in all, we have the finest collection of Saxon and Norman gravestones in the country. Now we're inside, we're surprised by the size of the building. It could have been chosen possibly as the cathedral when the Diocese of Derby was formed 50 years ago. But then, 1,000 years ago, the aim was to build as large a church as one could, regardless of the population. This beautiful chancel was restored at the end of the 19th century by a wealthy clergyman who was here at that time. And he brought in this beautiful reredos above the high altar, the piece in marble, and then above it the wood carving of the crucifixion, showing tremendous depth and detail of work. We've come into the Vernon Chapel, and first we meet Sir Thomas Wensley, who appears to have lived by the sword and died by the sword, because he lived a violent life. It's been documented, but he was killed himself in the Battle of Shrewsbury, 1403. Next to the tomb of Sir Thomas Wensley lies Sir George Vernon and his two wives, and Sir George was the father of Dorothy Vernon, who married Sir John Manners. And there's a romantic story to the effect that she first had to elope with him. Whether or not that is true, it is certain that their marriage meant the alliance of the Vernons of Haddon with the Manners family. And that brings us finally to the large monument at the north end of the Vernon Chapel, showing Grace Lady Manners and her husband, and it's interesting to note that the monument was put up in her own lifetime. She had the date of her husband's death inscribed on it, but left her own date of death obviously blank, and her children failed to do what was necessary and complete the inscription.
Although Bakewell never became a fashionable spa like Batlock or Buxton, the carefully maintained Bath Gardens do provide a focal point for the town. They date from around 1810, when the main square was redeveloped to allow more coaching traffic to pass through. Alongside what used to be Bakewell's public bathhouse, in a small garden dedicated to the British Legion, is one of the few remaining wells to be found. It originally supplied water to the public baths in the 18th century, and now serves as a reminder of the days when there was no piped water. Dick Alcott, you're a local historian. In fact, you've done a lot of research into the history of Bakewell.
Yes.
These wells were always very important to the town in the old days, weren't they?
Oh, yes. For many centuries, actually. But in the earliest days, well, they were absolutely dependent upon the water, a good flow.
What did people use this warm water for washing?
Well, the warm water for bathing, right from Roman times, and right up to the 1920s, always bathing, and for certain curative qualities.
That sounds a bit mysterious.
Well, washing of sore eyes in the water. I've seen that done myself.
Has the water got any curative qualities?
Now,
Yeah.
doubtful, because unfortunately the flow has been disturbed.
Now, every summer, in a Thanksgiving ceremony originating from pre-Christian days, Bakewell, like many other limestone villages around the Peak District, observes the custom of well dressing. The wells are covered in a colourful mosaic of flower petals and mosses and lichens, collected from cottage gardens and fields, and then pressed into a clay frame to depict either a biblical or a topical scene. The ceremony of blessing the wells only takes place once a year, but the colourful dressings remain on display for many weeks during the summer months.
You have provided in creation for the needs of all mankind. Accept, we pray, the work of those who have dressed this well, which we here dedicate in gratitude to you, and grant that we may ever find in you the well of life. through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
The procession now moves on to bless the site of St Mary's Well, another one of the 5 warm water wells once so vital to Bakewell's existence. Up North Church Street is one of Bakewell's oldest buildings. Parts of it date from the 16th century. It's known as Cunningham Place, after one of its many owners, but it's now the home of the Bakewell and District Historical Society. Brian Jenkins, you've been living in Bakewell, what, just 8 years now,
That's
is it?
right, yes.
And yet already you find yourself vice-chairman of the Bakewell Historical Society. How did that come about?
Well, this is just one of the nice things about Bakewell and about this society. If you show yourself willing to do a job, they'll give you one to do, and you get involved in that sort of way.
How did the museum building itself come about?
Oh, the building itself started as a building in 1534, but as a museum only in 1954. And that was when a group of local people rescued what was at that time a pretty derelict building from the threat of demolition and set about restoring it and decided to change it into a museum. But as anybody walks in through the door, the first thing they see is this great oak fireplace, which has stood here since 1534. There's a vast oak beam stretching across, supporting the back wall of the house. And I think you've got to realise that this was the absolute core to the house. This is where the main heating of the house came from, where all the cooking would be done, and of course where all the heating of water would be done for washing purposes. And a very, very fine example of a fireplace of its period. This is a room that we call Pitt's kitchen because Pitts were the last family who lived in this place. And it's typical late Georgian, early Victorian country kitchen. The cottage consisted of this one room. And it's interesting to think that here they did everything. They cooked, they washed, they sat and had their meals, and they sat down and chatted. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that everything which is on display in this museum in fact came to the museum by gift. Costumes have come in, little bits of jewellery, pieces of furniture, and of course quite a good collection of local tools. And we remember particularly one occasion last year when somebody rang up our chairman and said, I've sold my barn and I've got a lot of tools in there. And the result was we acquired a very, very fine collection of wheelwright tools. We didn't know what they were at the time, but that's how things come to us. One of the things which people remark on frequently when they come here is the accessibility of things. Obviously, we don't want people to be touching everything because costumes would soon be worn out. But they are there to be reached at. They are accessible. We have very few things which are in fact shut away in glass cases. And this makes it homely, accessible, and people can identify with it.
The River Wye here at Bakewell, although an important asset to the town, doesn't match the size of its namesake, the Great Salmon River Wye. It's a mere 20 miles long, its source being in Poole's Cavern near Buxton. Yet these swift-flowing and crystal-clear waters are home for the brown trout. But beware, fishing is by permit only. But the whole history of Bakewell seems to revolve around water. The bridges were built to span the rivers, the wells were dug to produce fresh water, and at last the power of the streams was harnessed in giant mill races like this. Here at the back of Victoria Mill is a giant but rusting mill wheel. It measures 16 feet in diameter and 13 feet 6 inches across. And it sat snugly in the basin here just below the mill race. Can you just imagine the power that that wheel must have produced as it turned in the rushing water? Actually, you couldn't make a trip here, you know, without tasting Bakewell's most famous product, the Bakewell tart. And it was in that building over there, the Rutland Arms, that the first Bakewell tart was made. But the recipe came about purely by accident. As a matter of fact, I've made a bit of a mistake. Everybody makes it. It's not really a Bakewell tart. You should really call it a pudding. At one of Bakewell's 2 pudding shops, production in the height of the tourist season reaches 1,000 a day, made to an original recipe and closely guarded by the Bloomer family.
The Bakewell pudding recipe goes back for over 100 years. It was created at the Rutland Arms Hotel in Bakewell. The proprietor, a Mrs. Greaves, instructed her cook to make a sweet. To create the sweet, she poured the mixture into the pastry case, and the jam should have been on top. But in actual fact, she reversed the procedure. The jam was put into the pastry case and the mixture on top. After dinner, the guests asked Mrs. Greaves what the delightful sweet was. So Mrs. Greaves had to ask her cook just what had happened. And when the cook told her, she said, well, carry on making the mistake. The guests were delighted with it. It's been a huge success. And thus the Bakewell pudding was created.
You know, as far as I know, I don't think I've ever eaten a Bakewell tart before. Oh, Bakewell pudding, sorry. Now, the baker recommends that you should eat these slightly warm. This one's fresh out of the oven, so it's a little bit soggy. Excuse me. Yes, I like that. I'm rather glad they made that mistake with the recipe. If they make them as delicious as this all the time, they'll be making them in another 100 years, too. Very nice. If you come to Bakewell on a Monday, you can't help but notice it's market day. There's been one here from time immemorial. The first records date from 1254, Bakewell becoming a market town by royal charter in 1330. Some 70,000 head of cattle are sold here annually, not to mention a whole array of other farm and country products, making it one of the largest markets in the county. Monday is not only a working day, it's also a social one. Oh, well, back on 2 wheels again. And if we cycle just a couple of miles from Bakewell, along the course of the river, we have a magnificent surprise in store for us. Oh. Well, what we've come to is one of Britain's finest ancient old manor houses. This is just a gatehouse, but through those massive oak doors, there's quite a narrow drive leading to a taste of 16th century life for us. And parts of the house go back 400 years before that. The first view of this fortified manor house is impressive. Haddon Hall is one of the best preserved and unspoiled manor houses, due, ironically, to the fact that for almost 2 centuries it was abandoned and neglected. It suffered none of the major rebuilds, therefore, of many other country homes. The hall was given the kiss of life by the late Duke of Rutland in the 1920s. He made it his life's work to restore it to its former glory, for all to see it and to fall in love with it. Gosh, this place is beautiful. And you couldn't build it, could you? And you couldn't buy it either. All the stone that it was built of was locally mined, and now it's beautifully weathered down in the sunshine and time to this lovely, muted, soft colour. And under the courtyard, which, as you notice, is sloping, is absolutely solid rock. So they could hardly chisel it out and make it flat to walk on. But at least I suppose it helps the rain to run off. here in the entrance to the banqueting hall at Haddon is proof of the Roman occupation of this area. This massive stone was dug up somewhere in between Bakewell and Haddon, and it carries an inscription dedicated to the god Mars. Translated, I'm told, it means to the god Mars Brachiocha, who was a sort of local god. Quintus Citius Sicilianus, prefect of the first cohort of the Aquitani, performs his vow. The banqueting hall, although the oldest part of Haddon, was built some 1,000 years after those Romans were here. Much of it is still intact, with the minstrel's gallery, similar to that found in many churches of the same period. It is absolutely beautiful, and a manor house of this size, as you might expect, has a wealth of rooms, each with its own story to tell. In fact, just a casual walk around the place and the imagination runs riot. Like many other medieval manor houses, Haddon Hall has its own chapel. It was a much safer life not leaving the confines of these secure walls in order to worship. The roof of the chapel was renewed in 1624 by Sir George Manners. His initials are actually carved on one of the beams. These superb medieval wall paintings were only recently discovered during restoration work. They may seem a little dull and lifeless today. In previous centuries, though, they must have been vivid and intensely colourful. Amazingly, the chapel and its contents span some 6 centuries in the history of Haddon. Well, these steps, which lead from the house into the garden, are named after Dorothy Vernon. Dorothy Vernon, last in line of the Vernon family, who eloped with Sir John Manners. It was during a ball to celebrate her sister Margaret's wedding in 1563. At the appointed time, Dorothy slipped out of the house, ran down these steps to meet Sir John before their long horseback ride to Leicestershire, where they were married. And it was that which caused the transfer of the house to the Manners family from the Vernons. And, of course, the Manners are the present owners, and they are the Dukes of Rutland. Well, it seems to me that we've really only skimmed the surface of the history of Haddon Hall and, of course, of Bakewell, famous for its puddings. But I hope at least we've whet your appetite to come and spend a day out here yourselves.